When I came out with the Katz-Moses stop block, I also released a video the next week about making a very simple one-runner sled. And that is my go-to sled. That is the one that I use all the time. A few years ago, I made a giant one, which I thought would be this great solve-all problem for me, but it turned out it was way too heavy, cumbersome, and over time it was so big the fence started to sort of change shape, which made it unusable. Recently I did the cutting board video, and I realized I needed a crosscut sled with both sides as well to fill out kind of my repertoire of 90-degree crosscut sleds. Sleds are super useful. Recently, my friend Tamar released this awesome video where she did the coolest sled of all time. I can't compete with her ingenuity, but what I can make is a super solid, best all around simple crosscut sled with, of course, a Katz-Moses stop block. So we're gonna start off by breaking down some plywood, and then we're gonna get into making this, and I'm gonna break down the 5-cut method so it is really digestible and you can get an ultra square sled. So let's get into breaking down some plywood. All right, so now it's time to glue up our fence. I cut double the amount of parts. I kind of just was on autopilot there because we can just take 3 of them and we'll be able to chop it into our 2 fences later. Good little trick that I've seen Tamar use. Again, sorry, I loved her video. Tamar is such an awesome woodworker. If you don't follow her, I'm sure you do. Is she clamps her sled fence to a level, which is a phenomenal idea, because as I look at this, even right now, there's a slight gap in the middle here, and if I just glued that up and clamped it, nothing's gonna fix that slight gap. So we're gonna clamp it to this level, and that's gonna ensure we get a really nice, flat, straight fence, which is, you know, the more care you take in your sleds in making them square, straight, and flat, just the longer it's gonna serve you super, super well. So let's get this fence glued up, and then we're gonna head over to the table saw and get our runners going. All right, now it's time to cut our runners. I like using hardwood, maple especially. You want to cut them so that they're like snug, but they still move, because later you're gonna wax them. So if they're a little bit snug, then once you wax them, they'll move a little bit more freely. But you also wanna make sure they're not the full height of your miter slots, because you know you get sawdust and stuff building up in there, and you don't want them to be running on the bottom. So I like to plane mine down so that, you know, it has a 1/10 or a 1/20th of an inch of gap underneath. So we're gonna cut these. I've measured with a pair of calipers, which are super handy, or you can, you know, work your way there with a tape measure and kind of get till you get close. We're gonna do that, run it through the planer, and then I'm gonna show you how you attach it to the base. All right, now it's time to attach our body to the runners. We are going to need to glue the runners to the body. We're gonna use the table saw fence to keep it relatively square. I mean, it doesn't matter because you're gonna square your fence up later, but the squarer you start, the easier it is to get it really square later. You need some dimes or pennies or washers, something to lift the runners slightly out of the slots. You're gonna want some super glue, some regular wood glue, and then you're gonna make sure you wanna countersink your screws. I have these number 6 by 5/8 inch. What we're gonna do is lay the runners in slightly elevated, glue it with super glue. That's gonna allow it to hold instantly. Flip it over, we're gonna screw it down. The wood glue is what's gonna create that really strong permanent bond along with the screws. And then we're gonna let that dry, and the fence will be dry. We'll chop everything up, get it together, and start squaring it up. All right, so we've got our fence. It is super, super straight, which is awesome. And that technique worked great. So we're gonna clean this up, make sure it's square and straight. We're gonna cut it to just over 3/4 of an inch tall, because that's how my Katz-Moses stop block, that's one of the positive stops in the adjustability of it. We're gonna put in some T-track. Now, this is the T-track that I have talked about before because it was inexpensive and it matched the stop block, but I found a new source for T-track that is so much beefier and already has holes drilled in it that's way less expensive than this stuff, like way. And I thought this was the cheapest. So I'll link that down below. We're gonna go ahead and put that in here, chop it up. You can cut aluminum with woodworking tools, just make sure you don't do it on a saw stop. And then we're gonna get to squaring up the fence, which is a whole process in and of itself, but I think I have a way to make it really easy. So let's get into this. Now we've got our fence put together, our T-track in, it's time to start putting this together. Now you can attach your front fence, and you want to now, and you could do that permanently with some glue, or you could just screw it in, but that's gonna keep your pieces from separating when we start getting into the next part, so it is important. You're gonna put your back fence on with only 2 screws. We'll get into this more in a minute, the 5-cut method. It's gonna be a pivot screw and a screw, you know, I don't know, somewhere right here. And we're gonna have to move that screw a few times when we're doing it, hopefully only once, but it may be a couple times. One other thing I want to point out and how I'm going to deal with it, because we don't hide our mistakes on this channel. My sled has a little bit of play in the runners, and it is not to the point that I like that will be accurate. So I'm going to fix that by gluing just a thin strip of veneer on both runners. Now this could have been avoided even if my runners were too small, had I thought about this when we got started. If I had just taken a piece of tape or something and shimmed both runners either in or out and just pushed them against the side, they wouldn't have been able to have any play. But instead, I just laid it on top and glued it. So had my runners been a little bit small, I still could have avoided this by just shimming them out when I glued it, because then they would have kind of rubbed on the sides and been unable to move. So thin strip of veneer, a little bit of sanding, we're gonna get it so it's nice without any play at all. And then we're gonna get into the 5-cut method, which I promise, it sounds intimidating, but it's actually pretty easy. We're gonna walk you through it. Okay, now we're gonna get into the 5-cut method. Now, don't be intimidated by this. We're gonna walk you through it. I'm gonna try and break it down as easy as possible. It really is easy. And we'll throw the formula up here on the screen in a second. The way the 5-cut method works is you grab a square, any square, just has to have one straight side, really. It doesn't need to be square or anything like that. This is this is your table saw sled, that's the outfeed side of your table saw. You are going to make a series of 5 cuts. The first one, you can just shave off just a little bit as long as you're taking a full fresh cut. You're then gonna rotate that fresh side against your fence. You're gonna do that 4 more times until you get back around to your A and B side here. You're then gonna make a cut of about 1/2 inch. You're gonna measure that, and you're gonna use this formula here. You're gonna measure your A side, subtract that from your B side, the side closest to you. A is away from you, B is closest to you. You're gonna measure both of those, subtract those. You're gonna divide that by 4 sides. You're then gonna divide that by the length of this last offcut. And that's gonna change because obviously each time you do this, you're gonna cut it. You're gonna get that answer, which is your error per inch. So that's your total error. And you're gonna multiply that times the distance from your pivot screw to the end of your fence. Your pivot screw is never gonna move during this process. This second screw that we put in is gonna move. You're gonna drill a new hole every time you do this. Make sure, I've learned this the hard way, you mark your old holes because you never wanna use those again. When you do finally get this square, you're gonna drill all new holes for new screws. You're not gonna move your pivot screw or the one that is keeping it in the square position, but you don't wanna use any of your old ones because it would just push your fence back where it was. Then, if that number at the end of that formula, after you've multiplied times the pivot screw to the end of your fence, is positive, you're gonna move that away from the user. If it's negative, it's gonna come towards the user. You're gonna use a feeler gauge, and you're gonna use a scrap piece of wood. Now, for a positive measurement where it measures away from you, you are going to take whatever that measurement is, let's say it's 0.018, you're going to put that in between your block of wood and the fence. You're gonna put your block of wood up against that, clamp your block of wood. We're gonna remove this screw over here, not your pivot screw, and you're gonna remove your feeler gauge. You're gonna move the fence up to your scrap piece of wood and put in a new hole with a new screw, and that's going to get you a lot closer. You're then going to run your 5-cut method again until you get that pretty close. And you know, I'd say once that error, that final number at the end of the formula gets into the triple digits, you're probably good to go. You know, if you're like 0.007, I'd just leave it. That's going to be pretty darn square. You know, you can cut a piece. Don't use the 5-cut method because that compounds the error. But just grab a piece of scrap, run it through once, get it. If you can't see any lead under there, I'd take it. So I'm gonna give you a real world example here on how we do this, and then I'm gonna run you through my formula and how we move the fence. And I think you should get it after that. So let's get into this 5-cut method. All right, so I got a positive 0.037. So I'm gonna make up 0.037 with my feeler gauges, which is 0.018 plus 0.019. And we're gonna take those two and we're gonna put them in between our fence and our piece of scrap wood, just like this. And then I'm gonna take a clamp that down, remove my screw over here. Again, remember, not your pivot screw. I'm then gonna remove my feeler gauge, put my fence forward, and then we're gonna run the 5-cut method again. Now, I'm not gonna bore you with doing the 5-cut method again, so we will move our fence here and run it again, and I'll check back in with you to see the measurement we got. All right, so 0.001, that's as good as it gets, folks. And that took 2 tries. So after you get it squared up, don't take out any screws that are in there. Just shoot some more screws in your fence and you're good to go. Now, it is time for a stop block. And even if you don't buy mine, I highly recommend you do this with a stop block. It makes your life so much easier. And if you do want to get a Katz-Moses stop block, I guarantee you this is the best one on the market. It has 0 deflection, which a lot of them do, especially the flip stops. They're garbage. It can be 2.25 inches to 3.75 inches tall. It has 1 inch of micro adjust, so you can micro adjust without having to move the whole stop. And when you're not using it, it is really easy to just flip around and put on the back of your fence out of the way. So I, of course, appreciate the support of all of you guys. So there'll be a link down below. You can head over to the Katz-Moses store and pick up a stop block. If not, I suggest you get one because it makes a massive difference. And it's one of those quality of life things that really is great. So last thing to do is sand this up and get some Katz-Moses goo on it, and we're all done. So guys, thanks for watching. We will montage you out of here. Check out the links down below if you want to support the channel. Stay safe in the shop. Have a wonderful day.